Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for waiting for us to gather ourselves, and welcome back to the second session of our teaching and roundtable event today on Palestine and genocide. As we said earlier, we couldn't have foreseen that we would be speaking on this day where the ceasefire has begun and Palestinian hostages have begun to return to their families and loved ones. We have several speakers today, and I just will briefly introduce them and then they will speak. We have Asa is a PhD candidate at McMaster University, specialising in international relations, green colonialism, and Islam. She's also an activist and a very important voice for Palestine in Canada at the moment. Fadi Enab is a son of a Palestinian Nakba survivor. He is a Vanier scholar pursuing his PhD in the Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba. Fadi is a community researcher and organiser focusing on issues related to anti-racism and migration. Dr. Chodny Desai is an assistant professor in the critical studies of equity and solidarity at the University of Toronto and specialises in comparative settler colonialisms, Palestine studies, the politics of the Middle East, state violence, cultures of resistance, solidarity and memory. She's also an organiser involved in many areas. Dr. Chibu Arthur Anyaduba focuses broadly on African and Black diaspora literatures, as well as literatures on genocide and mass atrocities. In his scholarship, he explores the representations of genocides and mass atrocities in Africa and is currently researching representations of mass starvation of Igbo populations during the Biafra-Nigeria War. He is also the author of the post-colonial African genocide novel, Quests for Meaningfulness. Professor Judith Norman is a professor of philosophy at Trinity University in Texas. She's also a committed member for many years of the Jewish Voice for Peace. Welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us. And I can't remember who's going to go first. Who did we say? Gad is going to go first. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for going ahead with this event even after we've received threats from, at least attempts by the MP and Zionist groups to cancel this event. We know that for a long time now, academic free speech is being severely restricted around the topic of Palestine, and they don't want us to talk about this as a genocide. And settler colonialism is a genocide, and I always like to just preface by saying, what we see now has been happening since at least 1948, when Israel was founded as a settler colony, and it was founded through the ethnic cleansing of the vast majority indigenous Palestinian population. And its ultimate goal is to actually erase all Palestinians in order to be able to claim our land. That's why we see it's appropriating our food, our culture. And so what we're seeing in Gaza now is a more obvious example of the genocide, but actually we've been enduring genocide, and it's been described as a slow genocide since only 1967. About 80,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel. Obviously now even more, adding on the about 15,000 Palestinians who were just martyred in this last month or so. So yeah, I just wanted to situate it in that settler colonialism is genocidal, and it is it's just really funny when they're trying to explain that this roundtable, it's not like including Zionist voices. Well, Zionist voices, they are supporting the genocidal project. A lot of these universities are happy to do land acknowledgements. And of course, we do recognize that we are on stolen land. We are in solidarity with the people of Turtle Island. But it's also like a lot of that is performative when they clearly, indigenous people are actually supporting us strongly. And we've seen also Palestinians, they were the first to support I Don't Know More when it launched several years ago, Palestinians back home. So I think that, this whole idea of neutrality needs to be challenged, and this idea that, we're like biased if we're Palestinian, or we're not including Zionist voices, just like in land acknowledgements, we don't include the other, voices of the white supremacists. We're also proud to be holding this space here. So yeah, I thank you again. And with regards to the other point that they were arguing about the resistance that I've made comments about how Israel was cited using actually killing some of the Israelis who were at the concert. We just received more information confirming that. And yeah, it's just really disgusting that anytime you're trying to confront Zionist disinformation, which is severely supported by the settler colonial media and politicians here, you're immediately defamed, silenced. And this is why I think it's so important that we lean in on each other, on progressive media. And yeah, I mean, it's not the first time that I face being defamed, you know, as a scholar. I write on how Israel colonizes Palestinian land through environmental policies like national parks and nature reserves. For example, until now, Israel builds national parks over land that Palestinians have been ethnically cleansed from in order to basically erase evidence of the Nakba. So basically, they'll literally plant a lot of European pines over the destroyed villages to hide evidence of it, label it as uninhabited. And we see the same thing actually until now here, where Canada still builds national parks without Indigenous consent, uses that as an excuse to expel Indigenous people because their argument is that people and nature cannot coexist harmoniously. This is actually a Western invention. So the argument of my research is looking at how do we decolonize Western environmentalism and we dismantle this binary between humans and nature. Because, you know, for centuries or millennia, actually, all over the world, we've seen examples of how humans and nature can coexist harmoniously. But, you know, how do we focus on the actual root of climate change, which actually lies in white supremacy and patriarchy, as well as capitalism? So, yeah, so all that to say is it's really important for us to be looking at what's happening in Palestine right now from an intersectional lens. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from all of you.
Thank you, Fadi. Do you want to speak next?
Carrie, you want me to speak next? Is that okay?
That's right, yes.
Okay, you can hear me okay? It's really an honor to be here with everyone, and especially I'm a big fan of a lot of your work here. And given the context that we're in, the institutional silence that a lot of Palestinian students are facing on campuses and the difficulty of speaking out. So it's an honor and a curse be standing in front of you on stolen lands to talk about my experience and my thoughts on advocacy while Palestine is getting eliminated in real time. I'll be sharing some of my experiences and my advocacy, and I guess I'll try to link in my story through my father's experience as a Palestinian. For me to talk about peace, we need to address those systemic inequalities and injustices, and the fact that even in their homes, the indigenous person is considered a threat by a colonial state. So even where we're not angry, where we're not resentful, we're just staying at home, we're concerned about our well-being. This was my experience watching my dad living away from home, watching the news, living his life through addiction. But I don't want to get ahead of the story. My father was born in 1946. In 1948, when he was 2 years old, he was displaced with his family and about 750,000 refugees from Palestine. And it was literally erased from the map. I appreciate the discussion earlier on with situating it within the settler colonialism, within the genocide discourse, because that's related to this discussion. And so from my family's perspective, losing your home, your neighbors, some of whom were Palestinian Jews around us, it wasn't only Muslims and Christians, meant no land, no dignity. This is something that indigenous people on stolen lands here echoes through their experiences. As a Palestinian, I grew up in the diaspora between Dubai, Jordan, and Canada, and you see through your Palestine in your parents' fear, desires, and their despair. When you can't own land, be a citizen, where you live or have full citizenship rights. My father visited his parents twice in my lifetime. This meant like going through the Jordan border, the Israeli checkpoints, and long waiting times. You have to get a new passport when you come back because it has an Israeli stamp. An Israeli stamp, you can't use it to go into a Muslim country, even though those Muslim countries are the ones who normalized relations today. We're talking again, my father is a Christian Palestinian family. My grandfather is George. I've raised in a Catholic Orthodox background. But yeah, I also have Muslims in my family. So picking sides between religion was not always a natural thing for me growing up. My father couldn't see his parents until they got ill, even when they got ill, when they died, when they were buried. For 40 years, he lived in the Emirates, and he got kicked out when he couldn't work. So you can't call that place home, even though when you were born there. If I fly with my white partner, she has more rights in Dubai, where I'm born, than myself. So this tells you the displacement of migrants, that even after displacement, it doesn't end. The afterlife of the Nakba, and that's why we shouldn't just look at what's happening just in October or today, but what's going to keep happening after the ceasefire, before the ceasefire. My family as Palestinians don't have a right to return or freedom to move in Israel. As a Canadian citizen, I can be denied entry because of my racial or ethnic background. So while my white Christian and Jewish neighbors across the street from me are able to fly to Israel, and I sit their house while they're gone in Israel, I fear of persecution and harassment, even though my father was born there and my aunts are still living there. So Palestinians know that they are either second-class citizens or they're garbage. As excess, you're not necessarily. That's the process of elimination. Israel is so strong in these moments in a way that there isn't a way of reconciliation, but perhaps that's the next step for a government when it's cornered. But even then, the struggle doesn't end. It's co-opted, and we have to keep fighting by words and action. But my story is also about intergenerational history of substance use or abuse. My grandfather, my uncle, my father all struggled with feeling alienated and struggled with substance use before death. Some in my family had disabilities, others committed suicide, even after leaving to places like Sweden. But all these men cared for me, peeled fruit for me really tenderly. I felt cared and respected by those elders. In Canada, I couldn't legally sponsor my father to live and care for him here. And so I had to physically escort him to Canada, to outside of Canada when he had dementia. And as earlier mentioned by Dr. Shibu about Rivka, she had dementia and she couldn't forget home. My father couldn't live to 103, but he died at 73, 75. And yeah, home, I had to soothe him every day from here while he's in a care home in Jordan. Every day, I'd lie to him and say, I'm coming to take you home. He wanted to go home. It was a daily thing, even throughout dementia. So 2 years ago, during the pandemic, he passed away in a care home, but not in my heart. And he wanted to be buried like a Christian in the ground in Palestine, and he didn't get either. He is in a Christian cemetery, but he's buried over the ground because the cemetery is too full, and you can't be buried anywhere if you're Christian. But that was the closest I was able to in Jordan towards being to the Palestinian border. So family separation, nail-fill alienation, stigmatization is a form of social death, and that's where some could argue that it's a genocide before these current events. So if we have to still, if he's still alive, he would have been troubled by the present while running from the past. He would have been concerned about my safety and well-being and not wanting me to speak out for fear of a backlash. Because backlash means no visa. Backlash means prison or death. So even though he was against Israel, the Palestinian Authority, the British imperialism, and bourgeoisie capitalism. And he was no expert in any field. And you don't need an expertise or more than a grade 6 education level, as in my father's case, to have that knowledge. So I share this with you so that the issue what's happening, again, it's contextualized and to look across geographies. Normal time is really more like colonized or suspended time in these situations. In terms of anti-Palestinian racism, you move here within 20 years. For me, within the 20 years that I've been living here, the post 9/11 context is really marked with a lot of racism against Arabs and Muslims. Canadians who are or perceived to be, again, I'm coming from a Christian background, I'm often mistaken for a Muslim, not for Jesus Christ, who also had a beard, or Mother Mary, who had a hijab on. But you often being singled out by settlers and state officials at home and abroad for differential treatment if you pass for an Arab or a Muslim, or both, or even a Palestinian in these moments. So today, according to the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association, silencing, defaming, willful exclusion of Palestinians and advocates escalated and becoming punitive in recent years. We've seen criminalization at the U of M campus, elsewhere. Students are getting criminalized for speaking for Palestine. This is why they want us to name and challenge anti-Palestinian racism. Nakba denial. What happened to my dad was not real. If it was, then it was necessary for Zionists to settle on this land. Justifying violence against Palestinians, defaming them, their allies. And some of the profs on this at the UFW have experienced this. Slander, such as saying that they are inherently anti-Semitic, terrorist sympathizers, or opposed to democratic values. These are common threads throughout, not just Canada. So silence in the face of anti-Palestinian racism makes it worse for allies and everyone to speak. And it shamefully casts them as controversial or hateful. Similarly, those gatekeepers, and those gatekeepers can be at your school, at your university, at your business, who pretend to be very kind, liberal, often insist on this two-side discourse and ignore the reality that Palestinians are routinely bullied for speaking for their rights. And today there's this strategy of anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism as a political strategy that we really need to be mindful of, which is more than just silencing, it's equating. So now when I share my story, in 2018, the University of Winnipeg was accused of anti-Semitism because I shared my dad's story and it's critical of Israel. And so you can even talk about your family experience and share that. Never mind, make legitimate critiques against colonialism and state, which we can do it against Canada here, but it seems when it's connecting the threads, you're considered more of a targeted transnational. So this semantic shift to this new anti-Semitism, which is rooted in Palestine and not European imperialism, has significant Islamophobic implications. In that, it depoliticizes the Palestinian resistance and paints advocates of Palestinian human rights as outside of the post-Holocaust Western moral order. It's almost like history stops for the Palestinian. It also gives institutions a pass. You might see at your university, like I might see things like Black flourishing at this moment, yet my university won't acknowledge things like ceasefire. Black and Indigenous and Palestinian solidarities are connected. And I've just came out of, my report is not published yet, but if you're looking at the experiences of Black Palestinian Muslim schoolgirls in Manitoba and across Canada, your hijab getting pulled, you don't feel safe wearing it at school. Those are who we need to center in those discussions, not a privileged ivory tower professor, but we need to center those students who are on campuses that really can't feel safe to speak because of a consequence. So framing it as a two sides and a conflict hides the asymmetry, the relation of domination. Palestinians are targeted on a transnational level, and a minimum to breathe is a ceasefire. And when you pull the occupation, apartheid, and colonization, Then we can have a conversation in the ivory tower and with white privileged white faculty members if they want to have a nice conversation with tea. But you know, we need to open the table. We need to have more chairs. We need to consider the soil and land that we're on, the university. So moving forward, the Arab Canadian lawyers would suggest things about freedom of expression on Palestine, that it must be upheld in those settings. Those who choose to speak for Palestine should not be subject of harassment, defamation, and punitive measures, including the profs who are supporting this cause right now. Palestinians need to be protected from false charges of anti-Semitism, and conflating anti-Zionism and criticisms of Israel with anti-Semitism is not productive for safe conversations. I think I had 10 minutes. Can I go on for another minute?
Is that okay? We've one speaker who might need to leave. Yes, you can. Yes, Fadi. Okay. Thank you.
Scholars like Frantz Fanon and many other Black and radical tradition advocate for the intellectual to be with the people and advocate for indigenous liberation, even if that meant putting yourself at odds with institution and settler mentality. Talking is helpful, is really helpful. And this is what I do for a living. But decolonization is more than a metaphor, and it needs material and land redistribution, which is more than just recognizing the other. I see you, I hear you, I feel you. That's great. But what are you going to do about the land? What are you going to do about the justice system, those in prisons? So this is more than two sides. Most of my research is on anti-racism and equity and focusing on indigenous Black Muslim experiences in the North End and in areas where there's a lot of poverty and impact of colonization. If you listen to voices of Muslim Palestinian girls, those students who are disadvantaged, you have to prioritize those experiences. It's not about balancing them out with white supremacist views. Various scholarships, whether you're anti-racist, tells you can't be neutral on a moving train. Indigenous abolitionist scholars have long criticized reconciliation and liberal politics of multiculturalism and asking us to look at social movements, disruptive ways of liberation. People have a right to be resentful. We have to fight back. Abolitionist studies, fighting back against reform, dismantling and rebuilding the system. So there's a lot to be discussed, and I'm happy to talk about more action-oriented themes after. Thank you all for your patience.
Thank you so much, Fadi. And there's so much overlapping with what you and Garo are saying about anti-Palestinian racism and false definitions. Chadni's going to talk now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to say thank you to the organizers. I know you've been met with quite a lot of resistance and, you know, a lot of complaints. And it's really heartening to see that, you know, we continue to speak about Palestine regardless of the attempts at silencing in this new McCarthyism that is unfolding in really brutal ways in this moment. I want to begin with genocide because this is the moment we're in. Genocide is a crime. It is unfolding in Gaza. And yet there is denial. There is denial among academics. There is denial among Western governments, particularly the United States and the government that represents where we live. Over 800 academics, legal, and specifically genocide studies scholars have warned of a serious risk of genocide being committed in Gaza. Though many scholars have allured to genocide in Palestine well beyond this historical moment, including scholars of Palestine studies, it is being confirmed as a textbook case in this moment by historians of the Holocaust and genocide studies. For those who might not be familiar with what the UN Convention on Genocide says about what the crime of genocide is, I want to quote, it encapsulates certain acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. These acts include killing members of a protected group or causing serious bodily or mental harm or deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, end quote. Israeli leaders have outlined their genocidal intent, specifically after October 7th, but also well before. Those of us that follow the discourses of Israeli leaders and many in the Israeli establishment, the call for genocide is not a new one. And some have even gone as far as calling for, the total catastrophe of the Palestinian people, reiterating calling for another Nakba, the catastrophe that ethnically cleansed and dispossessed 800,000 Palestinians from their homes and lands in 1948, which is not a finished project. It has been ongoing for the past 75 years. The Nakba is happening as we speak in Gaza right now. And of course, Fadi described really his family story of the surviving, what it means to survive the Nakba and its afterlife and what that has meant. And of course, Gada gestured to that as well. Israel in this moment, yet again, is using the Dahia Doctrine in Gaza. For those of you who are not familiar with the Dahia Doctrine, it is a deadly military strategy of asymmetric warfare and encompasses the destruction of the civilian infrastructure. According to this doctrine, every piece of basic infrastructure available will be targeted and destroyed, and the civilian death count will be on a grand scale. An Israeli military spokesperson recently stated, I quote, "The emphasis is on damage, not on accuracy," end quote, which demonstrates reckless disregard for Palestinian civilian life. While, as I mentioned, this doctrine has been used before, the aggression that we are seeing has been the deadliest manifestation of Israeli colonial and apartheid policies against the Palestinians since decades. The death toll in Gaza has surpassed 15,000, including 6,000 children. Tens of thousands have been wounded, and over 7,000 are reported to be beneath the rubble or are missing. Gaza has been placed under complete siege as food, water, fuel, and electricity have been denied, creating a horrifying humanitarian catastrophe. The Strip was already under siege for the last 16 years, but right now it is under a complete and utter and total siege. Hundreds of journalists, healthcare professionals, and academics have been systematically targeted and killed. Hospitals, ambulances, mosques, churches, bakeries, residential buildings, UN facilities, schools, and universities have all been targeted and much destroyed. The idea here is to make Gaza unlivable. Are the colonized, the oppressed, supposed to just kneel and die, be killed? Is it has been really incomprehensible to learn these past few weeks how so many people that live in the West cannot comprehend why an oppressed people fight, or why colonized people resist, or specifically actually why the Palestinians fight. Perhaps there's an empathy for other colonized peoples to fight, but when it comes to the Palestinians, there seems to sometimes be an exception. Palestinian history and context has been entirely removed or intentionally erased by the Western corporate media and their news reporting on the current events, and unverified news stories of a resistance group's violence has galvanized unequivocal Western support for an occupying power and its systematic killing. The decontextualization of Israel as a settler colony, an occupying power, and an apartheid state humanizes colonialism, and it dehumanizes the colonized. I'm going to say that again. The decontextualization of Israel as a settler colony, an apartheid state, and an occupying power humanizes colonialism and dehumanizes the colonized. Apartheid is a crime under international law. UN Resolution 252 considers the Israeli occupation to be in violation of international law, yet world leaders in the Western world, including the Prime Minister of Canada, have humanized colonialism and dehumanized the colonized. Why are Palestinians deemed non-human, killable with impunity? While the settler colonial analytic has some limitations when applied to Palestine, it is also quite generative, as it helps us understand how settler colonialism is about land and the desire of a settler population to replace the indigenous people of that land to make a new home for themselves. Zionism is an ideological and political movement whose central idea was the establishment of a national homeland for the Jewish people and the creation of an ethno-national state. To make this state, the indigenous people of the land had to be forcefully dispossessed, ethnically cleansed, massacred, and killed, which took place in 1948 and has been ongoing. The three defining characteristics of the Zionist settler state have been defined by Faiz Saig as its racial conduct, its addiction to violence, and its expansionist stance. So if we want to understand the regional component of Lebanon and Syria, also drawn into this, we can understand that in relation to its racial conduct. Three corollaries: this explicitly racial identification gives rise to its racial self-segregation, its racial exclusiveness, and its racial supremacy. And therefore, Palestinians become what George Agamben has called the state of exception, where Palestinians are evicted out of humanity and do not have the right to have rights. In this moment, if Palestinians speak, they do not have the right to speak. Of course, Palestinian agency is at the heart of the struggle. And so that's not to deny and say that, you know, Palestinians are evicted out of humanity and don't have agency. That's not it. But the idea is that every right that Palestinians have the right to is one that, you know, Western powers and particularly Israel feel can be eroded. Racial elimination is possible through the production of Orientalist racist discourses of knowledge production and tropes such as the terrorist who are constant foreign threats to empire and Western imperialism. Dehumanization achieves ideological normality. The ideology of terrorism demarcates an entire people as dangerous, as threatening to Western civilization, and thus extraordinary violence such as what we're witnessing is justified. And no matter how many war crimes a settler colonial power commits, our analytics matter. History matters. And so as I've outlined, the analytics of settler colonialism, apartheid, occupation, and genocide, all of which fall within the category of the Nakba. As Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian poet, reminded us, I quote, "We are not looking back to dig up evidence of a past crime, for the Nakba is an extended present that promises to continue in the future." End quote. Since 1947, there have been multiple genocidal moments where the Israeli settler colonial regime has engaged in mass killings of Palestinians and their mass expulsion and annexation of their land, causing severe physical or mental harm to the Palestinian community. And we are in this moment because the world has watched this Nakba over the last 75 years and let Israel act with impunity. Since October 7th, I also want to bring to light the context of the West Bank, where over 2,700 people have been injured. Settler attacks have forced nearly 1,000 Palestinians out of their homes in the West Bank, once again internally displaced. Israeli occupation forces have been raiding Palestinian cities and villages, brutally interrogating and torturing Palestinians in the West Bank. Palestinian prisoner organizations have documented around 3,000 cases of arrest in the West Bank and Jerusalem, in addition to the arrest of 4,000 laborers of Gaza that have been held captive in Israeli military bases. The total numbers of prisoners inside Palestine has doubled since October 7th, 2023. Palestinian political prisoners are at the heart of this struggle and are at the heart of this particular war, as their freedom from Israeli captivity is the central demand in terms of justice. What the Palestinian resistance forces are enacting is a form of abolition, freeing the prisoners, ridding the dungeons, dismantling the siege of Gaza, the largest open-air prison that exists on Earth. Like both Palestine and Israel, Canada is a signatory to the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the first human rights treaty adopted by the United Nations General Assembly and considered the building block of the international human rights system. Canada has been obligated from the time learning of a serious risk of genocide of the Palestinian people to exercise its influence on Israel to prevent the crime. However, as we're seeing, Canada is failing to uphold its obligation to prevent the commission of genocide. And, you know, are we surprised when we look at the mass graves across this country and the history of settler colonialism in this country and the brutal legacy of the residential school system, which was officially termed as cultural genocide? This dark history is a reminder of which side Canada will side on. Our colleagues from Palestinian universities, particularly at Birzeit University in the West Bank, are calling upon international academic institutions to take concrete action to stop the genocidal war on the Palestinian people and to end Israeli settler colonialism. In our universities here and across the country, we study and teach anti-racist, feminist, and anti-colonial thinkers such as Frantz Fanon. to understand and analyze power, injustice, oppression, and resistance. People cite concepts of anti-colonialism and decolonization on a regular, yet the past few weeks have revealed the immense abstraction of how people here in the US and the UK understand anti-colonialism, decolonization, and liberation. And I think Fadi mentioned it's not a metaphor. It's not some kind of abstract theory. Anti-colonialism, decolonization, and liberation are violent processes about power against power. History has showed us that time and time again in so many contexts across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The Palestinians are not an exceptional case. Many progressives, of course, as we're seeing in this moment, support the land back movement. This is what anti-colonial solidarity looks like. Yet we see an exceptionalism sometimes applied to Palestine. If you support land back here, what do you think land back means for the Palestinians? In Palestine, land back is not possible with the existence of the current apartheid system and the occupation. When they attempt to even try, you see the heavy price that Palestinians have to pay, including this brutal assault we're seeing at this moment. But yet people of conscience are speaking up across the world. Even here, we see all forms of solidarity, from labor to students, to Indigenous, to Black, to queer movements, feminists, and people of all, of various kinds of ethnicities and religious backgrounds come to solidarity in a mass way, as we're seeing so many take to the streets. Calling for a ceasefire, calling for an end to the siege, and calling for the end to genocide. We also see thousands take the streets in Yemen, Baghdad, Amman, South Africa, Morocco, in solidarity with Palestine and in opposition to the genocide. We see the backlash and the McCarthyist regression and repression against those that are speaking up. We're seeing mass arrests across different cities in this country as a way to scare and silence those that are standing up. But before I leave, I just want to remind us all, this is very serious what is happening right now. Yes, there might be a temporary pause, but the pause is temporary. In 5 days, Israel will continue carpet bombing Gaza. It will continue its genocide. So one of the last things I just want to say before leaving today is never again, really, it applies now. Genocide is not exceptional to one particular people. The way in which the Genocide Convention outlines what is genocide as a crime needs to be really thought out and needs to be really put into action before it happens. Why should we wait for a catastrophe to finish and then think about it and then theorize about it and write about it and document it and analyze it when we can actually act in this moment to stop it? Thank you.
Thank you. And I think our next speaker is going to be Judith, Professor Judith Norman.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here speaking with you all. I wanted to express my gratitude for you all, for the organizers, for the labor of particularly Black, Brown, and Indigenous people who made this possible with their labor, including emotional labor. The emotional labor of Palestinians who've been taking the time to do these educational tasks while having to process their own trauma. I've benefited from that education, and I want to express my heartfelt gratitude. I'm speaking from, I have prepared remarks which largely cover similar ground to what's been said before. So I think I'll take the tack of speaking from my my distinctive positionality. I am Jewish. I'm a longtime member of Jewish Voice for Peace, an anti-Zionist organization that arose in the United States in the 90s. I'm also a professor who teaches decolonial theory. And I've traveled extensively in the West Bank, and I was able to visit Gaza twice in 2015 and 2016. And I'm here in part to sort of bear witness to what I've seen and the stories that I was entrusted with by people in Gaza. Being able to travel to Gaza is, of course, as speakers have said, part of my privilege as a white person, as a Jew, as somebody with settler identity. I grew up going to Hebrew school, where I was taught a Zionist narrative that Israel was a land without a people for the Jews, who are people without a land. And so even at the level of rhetoric, Palestinians were effaced. And I learned later that this rhetorical narrative erasure had a material correlate in the genocide of the Palestinian people, a genocide that we see as ongoing. As somebody with settler identity, the land of Palestine was ethnically cleansed for me, and my supposed return, although my family has never in our family memory had anything to do with that area of the world. We're from Eastern Europe, but the land was cleansed for me, and I have the right to move there, to declare my possession of the land and to take possession of homes and lands that Palestinians have been evicted from violently, and encouraged to do so in good conscience. So as a child, you know, being a child, not having been told anything about Israel except that it was situated on empty land, I was given a little blue box and encouraged to collect money for the Jewish National Fund to build trees. And being a little child, you know, building trees, sort of planting trees appealed to me. It's a sweet thing to do. And I've learned since that childhood innocence, that childhood naivete was annexed into a form of settler innocence, right? That my desire to sort of plant trees became part of the settler colonialist policy of the effacement, as was talked about, the ecological dimension to this. So there's a political dimension, certainly a linguistic dimension, as Hebrew was recently made the only language of the Israeli colony in Palestine, but also an ecological dimension into which I was enlisted to help plant trees. The trees that were planted, that are being planted by the Jewish National Fund, are Aleppo pines, and it bears witness to the European character of the settler colonialist project of Zionism, right? Of creating a country, Jewish supremacist country of Israel, in historic Palestine. So these Aleppo pines grow quickly, they don't require a lot of maintenance, and they conform to what Europeans think forests look like. So they are sort of part of the European colonial imaginary. It's a colonialist ecosystem. The forests are non-native monocultures. The trees are the same age. This makes them vulnerable to disease and wildfire. The pine needles that drop from these trees that I helped plant are acidic. They tend to kill undergrowth, which prevents Palestinian farmers and shepherds from grazing their animals. They cause more global warming than they prevent because of, you know, their ecological situation. They make for bad science and also bad politics. Because beneath the ecological stuff, the planting of trees, there's a narrative of renewal. Okay, and this is something that I was taught. The idea of that Palestine was a desert, and the desert is a metaphor for barrenness, right? Palestine was an area that was barren, and I was told that Jewish occupation made the desert bloom. And so Jewish return will bring up about an ecological renewal is the propaganda to which I was subject. Okay? And this propaganda positions Palestinians as ecologically naive, unable to make use of the land in which they were occupied. So we have a sort of combination of erasure of Palestinians, denial of their existence, but also a sort of like a dehumanization, so that Palestinian settlement on the land is considered in terms of anti-scientific, naive people who are unable to make use of the land. The forests were certainly planted to efface some of the Palestinian villages, some of the hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian villages, which were destroyed during the Nakba, when 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from the land in order to make way for me and Jews to come and occupy the land as settler colonialists. So Zionism is a settler colonial project of transforming Palestine into a Jewish state. Okay? Zionism is a settler colonial project of transforming Palestine into a Jewish state. Zionism, as we've talked about, and I can't sort of say clearly enough, is not a Jewish project. It is a political, colonialist, imperialist project. It's a project in which Jews were used, you know, often willing, sometimes unwilling, as pawns, right, in a sort of a gesture of British colonialism. Okay? But as a Jew, as somebody who has this sort of religious and ethnic identity, I am anti-Zionist. And I live in Texas, which is right down the street from one of the centers of Christian Zionism. Zionism is not necessarily Zionism is not Judaism. Zionism uses Jewish identity as ideological cover for a settler identity, a colonialist project. Okay? And Zionism was very amenable to Christian anti-Semites. And that is very much in evidence in USian discourse, right? And certainly here in Texas, where anti-Semites who don't want Jews in their community think, well, Jews can go off to Israel, right? So Israel exists as a repository, as a sort of solution to the Jewish problem of where should Jews be, because people don't want them in their own backyard. They can go off to Israel, right, where it's empty, or who knows what it's like, and they can cope with things there. So they're more Christian Zionists than Jewish Zionists, right, by a considerable number. And Christian Zionist is often a viciously anti-Semitic project, right, of trying to get Jews out of, you know, the Christian community and locate them elsewhere. I think that sort of keeping the political nature of the violence in the forefront, seeing this not as a Jewish, Muslim, Christian issue, right, but as a political settler colonialist issue, helps diffuse some of the myths, you know, that have conflated people's understanding. It helps us understand that this is not, as was just said, a matter of two sides, right? That there's one colonialist oppressor, and then there's an indigenous population who've been resisting. So vocabulary like war or conflict that suggests that there's somehow two sides is inappropriate and helps efface, helps hide the entirely one-sided nature of this, right? Which the notion of settler colonialism helps reveal. Religion has nothing to do with this. Religion is an ideology that's being used to confuse and conflate what's going on, which is the political project of settler colonialism. And the final myth that the settler colonialist framework helps us diffuse is the idea, which I get all the time, right? This is age old. This is like, you know, goes back to biblical times or some nonsense place in the past, right? This idea of an age-old cycle of violence, right, depoliticizes the conflict, fails to see that there was a historical and political beginning, and, you know, by extension, that there can be a historical and political end. The beginning was the beginning of, you know, Zionist colonialism within Palestine, right, in the beginning of the 1900s, right? That was the beginning. Before then, there was a relatively peaceful, multi-ethnic, Palestinian, there was a relatively peaceful, multi-religious indigenous population, right? Which included Jews. Jewish settlement in the region is not a problem. Settler colonialism is, right? And when the Zionists came in the guise of settler colonialism, that's what created the Palestinian Nakba and gave rise to the Israeli genocidal project and the Palestinian resistance, right? So that's not an age-old conflict. That's a 100-year conflict, right? And unless we can see that, we are not going to be able to see a historical end, right? A political end, not a military end, right? The Israeli end state is to sort of press harder, right, to take over the land. The end needs to be, right, for a global acknowledgement of the legitimate grievance, right, at the heart of the Palestinian resistance, right, and to reckon with that in terms of, justice, right? At that point, right, there's not going to be Jewish safety. Not that Jewish safety needs to be the ultimate end. Everybody ought to be safe, right? But there's not going to be safety in the region until the Palestinian grievances are reckoned with, including the return of the refugees from the original Nakba. And at that point, so there are a bunch of myths that are sort of conflating and confusing our attempts to understand what's going on, and keeping in mind a settler colonialist framework will help diffuse some of those. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judith. That was really wonderful. And we're going to move on to Dr. Thibault Arthur Anyaduba.
Thank you so much. I feel I don't really have so much to add, other than repeat and echo some of the points already made. But I come to this conversation from another genocidal context, still connected to the imperial system that we are talking about, right? My family survived the genocide of the Igbo in Nigeria in the 1960s. That genocide was supervised by the British imperialists, who insisted that even if it meant killing 3 million people to hold and maintain control over oil resources and some other kinds of resources that they were interested in the region, that they didn't care. And that region was blockaded for nearly 3 years. And over 3 million people died. At least that was the contested figure. We don't know for sure because no one bothered to count. Thousands of people were disposed in rivers, so their bodies were never recovered. We still have stories about disappeared people who reappear and then disappear again, from that past. But the point I'm making is the Biafran region that suffered that genocide was defeated and collapsed back into Nigeria. And my family continued to live with their oppressor, with people who never acknowledged that what happened to them was wrong. And I grew up in that kind of situation, not even understanding the history, not knowing why my mom fears airplanes. Each time an airplane flies by, she looks for the next building to just take cover for whatever reason. Until a few years ago, when I came fully into awareness of what that atrocity meant, how they were shelled constantly. Just last year, she was watching a BBC coverage of the war in Ukraine and saw a bomb blast of a particular area and people killed. And she called me and started saying, "Oh, you remember the story I told you a few years ago about how I survived one bomb blast?" And I knew she never told me any story like that. I in the past, I tried doing a documentary, an interview with her and my grandma, who lived over 100 years. And both of them never talked about what happened to them directly. They never shared personal experiences. But she told me from nowhere that, oh, there was this bomb blast that blew apart a woman who was taking cover beside me, and her body, the remains of her body poured all over her. And she was covered in blood and flesh. And she passed out, and Red Cross folks found her unconscious and dumped her in this lorry filled with dead bodies to be disposed. Midway, she woke up and started screaming, and they took off thinking she was a ghost. And so that was the story she shared with me, and I said, you never shared this story before. And so people live through horrible traumas that you don't even understand, traumas that they themselves do not understand what they've become. And today we have repetitions of these kinds of horrors that people go through, people bumping into other people's traumatic experiences. I think my mom's, Toni Morrison's concept of remembering probably explains, what my mom encountered in the moment of watching that atrocity and then reliving a traumatic experience from her own past. And we try to make sense of this using this colonial concept called genocide, right? Even that very concept is not neutral. It doesn't capture the horror and the severity of what we've been talking about, the centuries of colonial destruction of populations of people. That concept was coined and was legally authorized by colonizers themselves. So they whitewashed it. And even with the whitewashed meaning of that concept, we still meet resistance because that concept doesn't exactly capture the kinds of horrors that we witness, the grave injustice and the lack of discourse about these injustices. So I just want to make that clear that even genocide is just the very beginning. It's a whitewashed concept. The only thing is that we find some kind of political currency with that, and we use it to agitate and call for different kinds of peace and cessation of killings of innocent people who have been racialized as those without rights. So for me, as an academic, I am constantly confronted because I try to do this kind of research and make sense of these things at the same time as I recognize that I'm living and working in a very colonial institution, right? So for me, it's that we must continue to search, to find, and to retain a firm language of our criticism, given the kinds of structures of colonization that we are confronted by constantly. So it's to find and retain and constantly find critical language and a critical position that does not whitewash conditions of oppressions and injustice in the name of nuance or balance. Some of the ridiculous things we've had to deal with in the past few weeks just to put together this small event make some intellectual sense amongst ourselves and try to educate ourselves about what's going on. So ridiculous that I haven't been in an academic event at the University of Winnipeg with the diversity of expertise and professors and academics that we were able to assemble within a short period of time. But we were told that all of those perspectives did not constitute something called balance, right? That if we didn't include a Zionist and a racist perspective, then we lacked balance. So it's to recognize, I think, in the context of Palestinian struggles, that what is at stake is perhaps what Edward Said has called a general history of colonial dispossession, right? The dispossession not only of land and material resources, but also the dispossession of our ability and our capacity to make and sustain discourse about our oppressions. The assassination of journalists that we've heard about and their families in Gaza, the targeting of intellectual and cultural centers such as schools and religious buildings, the intimidation of scholars, the threats that we've received, and including threats received by Palestinian scholars in different parts of the world, including the kinds of punishments directed at Palestinian students in this place. these are some of the ways that colonial dispossessions occur. So we must continue for me to resist a colonial academic logic that devalues and consistently dismisses the position of racialized and minoritized scholars and students. A colonial logic that questions the validity and significance of the scholarly perspectives that we articulate as academics and as scholars and as students. We must recognize the historical roles of universities in Western nations, and even beyond Western nations. My universities in Nigeria were very colonial. In 2012, when I raised the question of the Igbo genocide, I was victimized and almost couldn't graduate. That was the reason I actually came to Canada. And again, it's to understand how the colonial system functions. It's a total carceral state where your only escape is one other form of colonial subjection. You are necessarily forced to go through one colonial institution or another, one colonial path, in order to seek one kind of leverage or freedom or whatever you call it. So almost like a total and absolute subjection of people. And that's what we constantly have to negotiate and question. But the university, the Western university was not a neutral place. We have to just understand that the colonial university was never designed as a place of free inquiry into the truth of reality. The colonial university was the site of epistemic and different forms of institutional violence. A place that historically and presently produced and institutionalized racist and oppressive knowledge systems against colonized peoples. It's a place governed by all sorts of Eurocentric logics, largely advanced by academics and administrators who are gatekeepers and apologists of Western imperialism, and they are majority and continues to be. The Gambian poet Lenry Peters says that the Western colonial university massacres the souls of colonized peoples. It is a place that inflicts epistemic violence, not only on minoritized students and teachers, but also on students racialized as privileged white folks. And these are the kinds of things we explore in some of my courses. What do we do, and how do we make sense of this institution that pretends to be the site where we can explore our condition, make some kind of rational sense about what's going on, at the same time as it's the very institution that produced the conditions for which we even have to pose those questions in the first place. How do we deal with that? We hear things about decolonizing the university and decolonizing curriculums and hiring racialized professors in the name of all these decolonizing projects and things like that. But when it matters, we are the ones that are seen as threats. We are the ones who had to be silenced and made to obey the system, in order not to rupture things. So it's to recognize the institution we are dealing with. The university is not. It's a violent place, and its violence stretches beyond the walls of the university. It's the in a course. In some of my courses dealing with colonial schooling, some of what we talk about is in fact the centrality of this school in the colonial project. For many of my students, they were born and from very young ages, from 4 or 5, they've already been institutionalized in the colonial school. The school is where you build different worldviews. It is where even some of us find our love partners, socialize and grow. And those who go on to universities and, further into grad programs, you realize that the first 30 years of your life or so had been spent formed and formulated for you in the colonial school. So who are you and what have you become by passing through that institution? So it's to recognize what we are dealing with. really very endemic. And so when I hear some colleagues or some folks who pose questions about, the university as this site where some kind of critical or free inquiry happens, I just see defenders of imperialism and those who don't actually understand what we are dealing with and what we are seeking to dismantle here, right? But yeah, I'm happy to stop now. I think I want Fadi and Gada to have more time to talk.
Yes, and I think, thank you so much. And I think Gada would like to come back in again. And yes, this can be the more conversational portion. We've got a good 20 minutes left, and we've been answering questions in the chat, some of which are actually giving everybody an object lessons, and some of the racist dynamics you're discussing, and some of the othering and dismissing. And I wish people would really just listen to your words more, because you've answered all of these questions with your words already. But Gada, please go ahead.
Gada, your mic.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I didn't want to talk too much in the beginning just because I wanted to hear from all of you, and I was hoping to get some questions. It's unfortunate. A lot of the questions, like you said, are touching on things we've discussed, and obviously a lot of them coming from Zionists. That being said, I do think there are some points I want to address. So I think it's important to recognize that when Zionism was founded in the late 19th century, it was founded as a settler colonial ideology as well as an anti-Semitic ideology. It was founded in Europe by Theodor Herzl, whose intention was to create a Jewish state in Palestine. Then only about 5% of the Palestinian population was Jewish. The vast majority were Muslim, and there was also a sizable Christian population. So how would it be possible to create a Jewish state? It was only creatable through the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian population. And they understood that, but at the time it was understood that any country outside of Europe was empty, right? Or terra nullius, they're open to colonization. On the other hand, it was anti-Semitic because they viewed that actually Theodor Herzl believed that the fault why anti-Semitism was there and there to stay was he was actually blaming it on Jews. And he was saying that the only way for them to actually escape anti-Semitism is to leave Europe and colonize another country. And so I wanted to say how this is, of course, extremely anti-Semitic because it's, the real perpetrators are the white supremacists. So we actually have a common enemy as Muslims, Jews, as Palestinians. It's like we're all linked in this together, as cheesy as it is, but it's true, and that's why it also hurts me to see some of these comments. But basically, when Zionists really, Zionist colonizers began, coming to Palestine in the early 20th century, that's when Palestinians realized that when they were taking land, like the Jewish National Fund, they were colonizing our land, expelling Palestinians. That's when they realized, oh, this wasn't like a normal immigration project. This is actually a colonial project. And that's when we began to see Palestinians resisting against both the British occupation, which assisted the Zionist project, but also against Zionist takeover. And of course, because the Zionists were so severely funded by the British, they were able to succeed, the Zionist militias, in expelling 80% of the population. And what I wanted to emphasize, and I think is left out of the conversation a lot, is that Palestinians have the right to return to their homes and lands. And that's recognized by UN Resolution 194. So my grandfather, he's from the city of Ramle, which is now part of what's called Israel, and we refer to as 1948 Palestine. And at the time, his cousin was only 16 at the time. He was shot by Zionists. The women and children fled. They were thinking it would be maybe a couple of days. They would flee because there were horrific atrocities being committed by Israel, most notably Deir Yassin, where a lot of the women were raped. And so they were, at the time, it's just it's really something else when people are talking about now, accusing Hamas of beheading babies, of raping women. These are claims that have been challenged by mainstream media as well as as well as the Israeli state itself in times. But it's just so ironic because actually when the Zionists first were colonizing Palestine, Palestinians were shocked that the Arab Code of War was being violated, that, you know, women and children were also being targeted. So that's why women and children fled and a lot of the men stayed to fight. But in that case, actually, my grandfather's cousin was killed by the Israeli regime. And of course, when they were expelled into Syria, they were, until now, I can't even visit Ramla with my Canadian citizenship. I can't even, you know, see my grandfather's home because I have a Palestinian ID or a Hawiyya for my mom. She was born in the occupied West Bank. So in 1948, basically, the Zionists were able to take 78% of Palestine. In 1967, they occupied the remaining 22%. And they could have just annexed Gaza and the West Bank, right? Like they had the power to do that, but they don't want to because they are an apartheid, racist, ethnocentric state. The point for Israel was they wanted to control our land and resources without having to grant rights to the Palestinians and also without having to include us in their demographics, right? Because if they were to include us as like Israeli citizens, then then all of a sudden it's not a Jewish majority. So to answer somebody in the chat saying, oh, like Palestinians, they have equal rights in 48. No, that's not true. You can actually see how there's over 60 Israeli laws that discriminate between Jews and non-Jews. We can, you know, if you want to get into the West Bank, I mean, you can just look at children being arrested there. We can look at Palestinians being arrested constantly without charge or trial. In my own village of Madama, outside of the city of Nablus under Israeli occupation, we're constantly being invaded, constantly have to check on my family. You know, even sometimes I've visited Nablus and, you know, any night, you know, Israeli settlers will just come. And of course, the settlers, they're usually armed. We don't have any arms because we're severely surveilled and, you know, oppressed. But the settlers will come down and they're on the hilltops usually, and they will come protected by the Israeli army just to like vandalize stores, just break watermelons. Like they'll just kind of wreak havoc. And their point is to kind of make life unbearable, or maybe just, you know, just expressing their violence and their superiority. I remember even when we had like graduation parties, they would try to like blast their music. It's just in a way that they couldn't stand Palestinian joy or presence. And we see that, of course, during Eid and like all these holidays, we see this increased Israeli violence. It's like they cannot stand our joy. And yeah, so that's why I wanted to kind of just touch on like, it is an apartheid, and it has been recognized by two of the biggest human rights organizations, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. And it is shameful that Canada still refuses to recognize that it is an apartheid state. And, you know, and someone mentioned something about like, you can tell who is the powerful in a situation. And it's true, like, it's not hard to look at what's happening in Palestine and see that Palestinians are the ones who are oppressed, especially Gaza. I mean, they've been besieged for the last 17 years, never mind illegally occupied from 1967, long before there was a Hamas, right? Or, you know, or even look at the West Bank. I mean, you know, they occupied us in 1967, but since then they've just been taking more and more of our land. Like there's just morsels now. So people talking about a two-state solution, the two-state solution is gone a long time ago. There's no, you know, it's not even viable because there's so many settlements now. And also a two-state solution is not just because we have the right to return to our home, right? My home is not part of the West Bank or Gaza, right? My dad's home is Ramle. So no, even international law backs up. And what we're asking for is a one-state solution. But actually, all we're asking for is justice, freedom, and equality. These are the three ethics principles that really guide Palestinians. And the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which was launched by Palestinian civil society back in 2005, seeks exactly that. It's just, you know, achieve these three goals. And it's trying to make sure that the apartheid wall that Israel has built can be dismantled, that illegal occupation is gone, that there are equal rights between Jews and non-Jews, and also that, yeah, of course, that Palestinians can return. So I just wanted to touch on also how we talk about like, you know, it's clear that Palestinians are being oppressed. Also, look at our strongest allies, right? Like one of our strongest allies right now is South Africa, because they have dealt with apartheid. You know, we're seeing now countries cut off diplomatic relations, but South Africa has been doing that for so long. Also, you know, at the same time, like, who's supporting our oppression? The United States, Canada, settler colonial regimes, imperialist states. So I know I'm taking up a lot of time here, but I wanted to, I guess, touch on these points and also say about this whole topic of indigeneity, okay? Because I think this can be really weaponized by oppressive people, okay? So indigeneity, the way I understand it, is actually a people who are facing colonization. So Palestinians, they've been living for millennia in the land of Palestine. And, you know, so when they're facing colonization, they are indigenous people, right? But we can't just be indigenous by saying, oh, we were there originally. But then, like, we can say we're all indigenous to, like, we all originally came from Africa, right? So we can't use that. And also, I want people to recognize that, you know, just like South Africa, when Nelson Mandela said, you know, people are welcome to stay, right? If you recognize our leadership. And I wanted to say that there's actually brilliant scholarship by Dr. Salman Al-Basita, a Palestinian scholar on return, that actually shows that actually the vast majority of Palestine is mostly empty. About 25% is what Israel created, like national parks, using, you know, those really harmful pines that actually are burning on their own. And there's actually, they actually don't live very long. They get attacked by pests, and, you know, they're not suited for the land, right? And at the same time, I want to mention that Israel is actually deforesting. Like, they removed so many of our olive trees, hundreds of thousands, and our indigenous flora, because they're trying to erase its, like, Palestinian character, and they're trying to make it more European-like. And there was this one case that I saw about, like, for 70 years, the Jewish National Fund was just like planting pine trees and they were dying. And these people were able to return to their village, these Palestinians, and they were actually able to find how some of the pine trees had split in half and an olive tree grew in the middle. So I think that was, like, so powerful. It just speaks to how the land itself is resisting, and the Palestinians have been resisting, you know, and international law supports the right of colonized and occupied people resist, like, even through armed struggle, right? So it's really hypocritical when people are, like, supporting Ukraine in resistance under occupation and they don't support us. I think I'm going to keep it there for now. I spoke too long, but I do want to touch a bit on, like, what can we do after.
Well, thank you so much. No, those were really, really important points. And I just want to say that a lot of what everybody has spoken about, but specifically what Gada has spoken about there, was documented and sourced and discussed in the teaching this morning quite extensively, the settler colonial definitions and Theodore Herzl. So if you didn't attend this morning, you can go back to the teaching which to answer other questions. We will be sending out the links. We'll be putting up the recordings on YouTube, and we'll send out the links to all the registrants. I'm not sure exactly what the timeline is, but in a little bit is the answer. I just want to show some of the questions here, because we've had some important questions. I just want to acknowledge a comment from Bill Newman, that Ireland is an outspoken ally. Well, certainly some aspects of the political system are, and certainly Sinn Féin is calling very loudly for the expulsion of the Israeli ambassador. But yes, there, you know, many of us have lived in Northern Ireland, an occupied territory, and many of us do have first-hand experience of settler colonialism, which is why we're drawing on it. There's a question here from Hugh. And maybe, I don't know who wants to answer, but all of it. How does it make our presenters feel to have their trauma disregarded in these attempts to divert the conversation to Hamas? I personally find it upsetting, but I'm not the one being directly attacked. And I think you've all addressed this one way or another, but does anybody want to speak to that issue more of when you're currently speaking, to even still be aligned with, you know, terrorism, with the person who has no morality, with somebody who's lacking authority, to have your scholarly academic credentials stripped away, and frankly to be labelled in a highly racist way? I wonder what your thoughts are.
I mean, I just spoke, but I would just say it's really disgusting, you know, like, I don't think people understand the trauma of statelessness. Like, you know, it's very few people, like, you know, when I speak to Tamil people, indigenous people here, it's like I feel like I can breathe a little bit, because people don't understand how much we're erased and villainized. But also, like, the case of Palestine is quite unique, because, like, we noticed, like, Palestinians, like, we're not even allowed to speak about our trauma. And I also want to recognize how anti-Palestinian racism is extremely linked to Islamophobia, right? So they draw on the trope of like, we're terrorists, like we don't deserve, you know, they try to dehumanize us so that they can justify their human rights violations. So yeah, of course that hurts, and you know, and we just have to be strong in recognizing that a lot of times what they're accusing us, the Zionists, is actually them projecting their own violence, you know, and like, yeah, I'll keep it there.
Anybody else need to address these questions? Let's see.
It's hard not to say anything because there's so many questions, and I know everyone have thoughts to share. But I guess what strikes me too is that there's a common link through a lot of the questions about assuming that the colonizing or an indigeneity is about an identity only, or a specific, like it's also about libidinal investments, psychological investments, emotional investments, the way Judith was talking about, like it's a racializing experience. My focus, and as a PhD student, is to look at how newcomer refugees, when they arrive here, their interactions with indigeneity, the anti-indigenous racism that some of them adopt, some of them might challenge. And so that complicates the notion, given that refugees are also indigenous from some groups before coming here. And now they're on stolen lands, almost engage in the similar ways of patterns like a white conquest settler. And the same way in Palestine. We can't generalize on the Palestinian side either. There's a class interest, there's a bourgeoisie interest that's completely at odds with those excluded from the political working class group. And so, yeah, we need to be mindful on those distinctions. We don't refer to all Jews as colonizers. We refer to Zionist Jews as colonizers, which is also a government stance now, which is very dehumanizing. And so, yeah, just to be very clear, I learned a lot of my resistance from Jewish solidarity here in Manitoba. The one who helped bring our daughter to life was a Jewish doula. The ones who taught me at school were Jews. The authors I love reading are Jewish scholars. And so that's where it really hurts when you're dismissed, especially when you're citing Jewish scholars themselves who survived the Holocaust, are critical of Israel and being framed now as anti-Semite. Given that the Arab and the Jewish were both considered not part of the Aryan race. And so there's a huge misunderstanding there and demystifying. And so, yes, of course, it hurts to be having your trauma displayed and talking about it every time. At the same time, people should know, young students should know, it's not a rational conversation. Sometimes I feel professors might not know and they have bias, like a white privileged author or professor, but I feel also that some do know what they're doing. They do take a stance on Zionism. They do have relations with Zionists. They have Zionist ideologies. They want to look at the Holocaust experience just within Germany, and instead of looking at the politics of what led us there and what keeps going before and after that period. And so that's what we're critical of. And there's a lot to learn from the German Jewish experience. And so that's what we're trying to do, I feel. I'll just stop there.
If I can add also onto that. Like, I just wanted to say, like, actually for me, I was doing my master's in environmental studies, and one of my favorite professors, who's Jewish and who described Israel as a disgrace to her people, and she was anti-Zionist. She's the one who actually convinced me to write about Palestine. Like, I was going to do my whole project on labor, and she's like, I don't see a lot of Palestinian graduate students in social science, give voice to your people. And of course I'm like, yes. And I ran with it. But like, yeah, it's extremely offensive to me, and I will always defend that Judaism is completely different than Zionism. I also wanted to note how, if some people in the comments were like, oh, like, when was Palestine used, or how do you know it's colonial? It's actually, you can just look at like Zionism's history. Like, they used to be really open about it. So for example, the Jewish Colonial Trust was the first Zionist bank, okay? And its subsidiary was the Anglo-Palestine Bank. This was later renamed the National Bank of Israel. So it, like, they used to be more open about it. Now that colonialism is like a bad word, they obviously like are more careful, but you know, if you look for the information, it's all there. And I want to recommend this book by Rosemary Sayegh. It's called Palestinians, Peasants to Revolutionaries. It's my favorite book on Palestine, really beautiful, because it like goes into Palestine before 1948, our culture and like what happened, and kind of focuses on the perspective of Palestinians in refugee camps in Lebanon, which is often neglected. I also like the book Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ilan Pappé, who is himself a Jewish Israeli scholar. I thought that book was really good as well. And someone was asking in the comments the questions about the Arab countries. It's shameful what the Arab countries have been doing since 1948. Both of these books that I mentioned actually outline how they've kind of betrayed us from day one. And I want to focus on the governments. Again, like the people themselves are very much pro-Palestine. We see today how they're really pressuring their governments to do more. And I think about what we can do, I really emphasize that we need to come together as the grassroots, right? We need to mobilize, especially in a very diverse country like so-called Canada, right? We need to really do outreach in like different communities, the Christian communities, Muslim communities, like different ethnicities, be like how we're all linked in this together, and you know, support each other. You know, when we hear about, you know, Yemen, you hear like we need to come up to that as well as Palestinians. Like I try to hold myself accountable to challenging oppression within my own community. I mean, you can see that on Twitter, for example. I challenge, you know, homophobia. I like, you know, I challenge mosques for their complicity in Zionism. So I think it's really important that we hold ourselves accountable. And about the Holocaust, I actually wanted to mention this because not a lot of people understand, like know about this point, but basically when Israel began really like colonizing Palestine in 1948, they're actually the first ones who used the word Nakba. And they used the word Nakba when they dropped leaflets on Haifa. And they were warning people, literally warning people, we're going to do the Nakba to you. We're going to shell your villages and break your backs. And actually the document, when it was translated to Hebrew, and this is in the Haganah archives, this is the precursor to the Israeli army, it translated Nakba to Holocaust. So Israel was literally like, we are going to do the Holocaust to you. And it's so crazy how Holocaust sometimes, like it became like anti-Semitic, like it's being defamed to compare the Nakba to the Holocaust, when literally that's where the wording, Nakba is obviously an Arabic word that means catastrophe, but when Israel first started using it. So yeah, I mean, it's just like amazing that, you know, I want to recognize how it's just, you know, seeing Jewish people in, you know, like in Congress, like 200 of them, they got arrested, right? And here we see so much. You know, I have Jewish comrades, they've linked arms and arms with me in so many events, you know, putting their lives on the line and not saying not in our name, right? So I think that's really beautiful. And I really respect your perspective, Judith. Like, I think there's so much beautiful and just like owning to that growth and like, you know, yeah, and I wanted to speak a bit about resistance because I feel like we can get demoralized sometimes, but I can say that in my own experience, I felt like I have achieved several victories. And I feel like I've achieved those victories when I've taken risks and it kind of went against the system. For example, I did my master's paper on, green colonialism, and I got my faculty of environmental studies to boycott Arava, which is an Israeli academic institute that focuses on environmentalism. This was the first academic boycott in North America. And it wasn't that hard, you know, I presented my research and, you know, there was pushback, but that's what you do, right? Also last year, there's the International Studies Association, which is like the biggest conference in my field. And so we were going to do a panel on BDS for the first time. And explicitly, the organizers of the conference told us that we were rejected because it wasn't quote unquote balanced. And so, you know, I didn't respond. I can be very like honest. So I just said, this is anti-Palestinian racism. If you expect us to be honest by bringing in white supremacist voices or Zionist voices, this, and this is academic freedom. And they tried to push back, like they tried to, you know, until they basically guaranteed like, we're gonna approve your panel next time. And they did, we're able to hold the panel this year. So it's like, you know, we hold on to these victories and we just keep building on them. I think we all have our own skills, interests, life ways to see what can we do for Palestine. Maybe that looks like only signing a petition. Maybe that looks like doing art or like, you know, speaking to people. I think all of that helps. And yeah, I just wanted to keep it at like a more hopeful note.
Well, thank you so much. That's all really important. And I've just wish some people are sharing some of the actions. Manitoba Legislative Building, Saturday at 1 o'clock. I hate having to say it every week to meet there, but we will have to keep meeting until Palestine is free. And other people are sharing actions. I think we'll need to wrap up because people have been with us, and we had over 200 people this morning, and I think possibly the same here, which was far beyond what we'd imagined when we convened first. And I'm just so grateful for all that you've all shared. And I'm going to end with I've been following Mohammed Smiri, a Palestinian in Gaza who has survived with his family every day, watching to see, maybe the rest of you have been following this too, I am still alive. He would tweet every morning, and sometimes I'd be waking at 2 o'clock in the morning just to see I am still alive. And yes, there's thousands who have not survived, but following one or two voices has also given insight. And he tweeted this morning, "We returned to no water, no food, no electricity, no internet, nothing." So I think it's really important that we keep our eyes on the fact that this is by no means over. And Aziza Kanji has written for the Yellowhead Institute, which is really what Gada has just been saying. Even in the face of powerful apparatuses of state repression, Palestine solidarity marchers continue to gather in streets around the world in the thousands and the millions. We are standing with the global majority here. It's very clear. Palestinian poetry persists in teaching life in the midst of death and devastation. And people mourn the precious Palestinian lives wrongly taken with a Quranic verse, "From God we all come, and to God we will return." So I want to end with a poem, if I can just take, one more minute of your time, from Musab Abu Toha, who was arrested and then released in this last week, the poet. And he's just sent out a tweet in the last hour or so saying he's recovering from severe beatings, but he is alive. He recently won the American Book Award and the Derek Walcott Poetry Prize for his collections, "Things You May Find Hidden in My Ear." When you open my ear, touch it gently. My mother's voice lingers somewhere inside. Her voice is the echo that helps recover my equilibrium when I feel dizzy during my attentiveness. You may encounter songs in Arabic, poems in English I recite to myself, a song I chant to the chirping birds in our backyard. When you stitch the cut, don't forget to put all these back in my ear. Put them back in order as you would do with books on your shelf. The drone's buzzing sound, the roar of an F-16, the screams of bombs falling on houses, on fields, and on bodies, of rockets flying away. Rid my small ear canal of them all. Spray the perfume of your smiles on the incision. Inject the song of life into my veins to wake me up. Gently beat the drums so my mind may dance with yours, my doctor, day and night. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to all our wonderful speakers. And I want to remind everybody that our event was blessed from the beginning to the end for its past, present, and future. And so we have been sent a blessing and a closing by our elders in our community. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.